Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Frequency Matters podcast. I'm Eric Higham, and I'm here with Pat Hindle. And in this episode, we're going to talk to Earl Lum, the president of EJL Wireless Research, about what he's seeing in the wireless infrastructure markets and get his thoughts about what the future holds for that segment. So welcome, Earl. It's good to catch up with you before you head off to some other part of the world. And how are things going?
Thanks for having me, Eric. And it's great to talk to you, Pat, as well. And I am doing okay. And it's been a very busy summer. And as we get into the fall, MWC Las Vegas is coming up in a couple of months. So that will be one of the next events, is in addition to 5G Americas that's coming up in Dallas.
Yeah, you're a busy guy. And you mentioned a busy summer. And you recently released a suite of reports on the global macro cell market, considering active antennas, remote radio, distribution of baseband units. So lots of great information there. Let's tee up this discussion with the facts and figures, the numbers. How did the RAN market do in 2023? And what have been the biggest drivers for the RAN market in the past couple of years?
If you look at the RAN market, and specifically you look at the distributed unit or DU, that segment was up 16% year over year in 2023. And the radio market, which includes active antenna units, was up 27% in 2023. So we had a very robust year in terms of unit volumes. Regarding the actual figures for the financial market, in terms of the OEM vendors, I don't have that with me offhand, as I only track typically the units.
So we've heard about the importance of China, along with some of the trade issues that we're having there. How does this market segment out geographically? What trends are you seeing regionally?
So from a regional perspective, Pat, Asia Pacific was approximately 85% of total unit shipments for radios in 2023. And of the 85%, roughly 59% of that was in China. 12% was in India, and 13% was the rest of Asia Pacific. So China factors significantly into the overall wireless industry, and its volumes are essentially the largest from a regional perspective, as well as globally. So being or not being in China has a very big impact on volumes and on revenues, also on profitability as well for a lot of the vendors in the entire supply chain, whether we're talking about components, semiconductors, or the end subsystems and systems themselves. So North America, as an example, was 8% and has been dropping. Europe had a major decline in 2023 as well, and hit mid-single digits.
Do you think India is growing fastest compared to the other regions?
India was growing very fast, but it's typically a very short cycle for them. So what was going on in India over the last couple of years was they were one of the last regions to get 5G and to have their auctions for the C-band and then start deploying. So we had 2 out of the 3 operators in India, Reliance Jio and Bharti, that were able to deploy their 5G networks immediately upon getting their spectrum. And then Vodafone Idea is the one that's been in the penalty box for the last several years because of their financial situation. And that got resolved earlier this year with the secondary offering on the public market. And I would expect that they're going to start deploying their 5G sometime late Q4 this year and beginning in 2025. So they're about a year behind the other 2 vendors or the other 2 operators over there in India. So I would expect that India will come back a bit. It's been on a lull this year in 2024, but I would expect it to snap back a bit in 2025, partially because of Vodafone Idea.
Thanks, Earl. Earlier, you just mentioned systems and components. And back in my analyst days, we were so focused on massive MIMO and millimeter wave systems. And that's exciting for the industry because it means an enormous number of channels. And there's the question of technologies and architectures. But what's the reality? How widely are large arrays being deployed?
I think originally back in the beginning of 5G, everyone's speculation was that we were going to be doing 64T, 64R configurations for the massive MIMO. And I think that's turned out to be relatively true in some regions. So North America, for example, and specifically in the United States, is predominantly 64T. China, through their first several phases, has been 64T. But the rest of the world, when they started looking at the power bill or the energy bill for 64T, decided that, maybe 32 is good enough. And we don't need the vertical beamforming features that are found in the 64T. And so most of the rest of the world has opted to go 32. And in India specifically, it is 32. In Japan and Korea, it is 32. But the interesting thing to note there is as the size of the 64Ts have come down and the weight has come down, they're actually going back and upgrading from 32 to 64. One of the reasons why they were limited to 32 was because of the way they deploy the radios over there in those two countries. And there's a maximum limit of 2 people that can carry the radio and hoist it up to the tower. So the original weight of the 64T was beyond that capacity. And so they opted to go to the 32 because of the restrictions that they had. But now that the weight of the 64 in probably what we now would call Gen 4 or Gen 5 of most everyone's designs has come down to that sub 15 kilo weight so that you can actually have one person carry the radio up to the tower.
Interesting. I had no idea that was one of the drivers for that.
Yeah.
So following up on the architecture, what's going on with Open RAN? I know you haven't been a big fan of Open RAN. So how is it deploying, and what are the challenges that might be holding things up there?
So you're right, Pat. I have not been a big fan of Open RAN for I think, some very, very good reasons that have proven out, as we've seen some of the operators in the U.S. and the operators over in Europe and around the world starting to look at Open RAN technology. And one of the issues has always been in my mind, it's very difficult to make one radio, let alone hundreds of radios. So if you're a radio unit supplier, you're not going into the market thinking you're making one unit for C-band for 5G. You have to go into the market thinking you're going to make 100 units of different flavors, of different MIMO configurations of 4T, 8T, 16, 32, 64, and of those configurations, multiple frequency bands, because every operator wants their own special radio. So there is not a one-size-fits-all. So if you don't have deep pockets on the radio side, you're not going to make it. On the DU side for the baseband, I think that's proven out to be, again, very difficult because the operator itself wants a supplier that actually supplies both pieces. That's why they have Ericsson and Nokia and Samsung, Huawei, or ZTE. And so when you try to switch from the older way of doing things to this new architecture where I may have 10 suppliers, 15 suppliers now because I have a bare metal server supplier, I have an orchestration software layer supplier, I have a core network supplier, I have the physical radio and its software as a supplier, and that may be different than the massive MIMO radio supplier. All of these things have to work seamlessly from component to component. And if you're buying from a single vendor, you're guaranteed that that will be the case. But as we know with front haul, any glitches in the front haul is going to cause issues with the communication between these components across multiple vendors. And I think that's what we've seen in the early days. And possibly when you look at the Ericsson deal with AT&T in December of last year, that EJL Wireless was able to break that story. They went to a single RAN situation with Ericsson, and certainly there was a financial incentive to do that. But if you look at some of the other deployments, I think single RAN is certainly something that is safe for the operator. So in the case of Dish, when they moved to Samsung, the Samsung part of the network was initially single RAN, and then over time they'll add more radio vendors. But the key thing to note on Open RAN is I think you're only going to see a single vendor for the baseband unit, and you may have multiple vendors for the radios, but it is extremely unlikely to see multiple vendors for the baseband unit. And I think in terms of the TELUS deal with Samsung up in Canada, again, it's a single vendor for the baseband with multiple vendors for the radios. So I think that's the trend that we need to be on the watch for as we move forward. So it means that if you're a baseband supplier, it's going to be very difficult for you to compete against an Open RAN solution from an Ericsson, Nokia, or Samsung. And if you're a radio supplier, then your best bet is that you hope you can be number 2 or number 3 or number 4, depending on the vendor lists and the down select at these mobile operators that are considering Open RAN. One of the questions that you asked about Open RAN was challenges, and one of the major challenges that's come up in 2024 is when Ericsson introduced ULPI, Uplink Performance Improvement, as part of the standard for Category B within Open RAN. And Category B is specifically the massive MIMO specification for the front haul. And basically now Category B has been split into 2 subcategories. Class A, which is where the ULPI and the equalizer part of that is integrated into the radio, and Class B, which is where the equalizer is in its current configuration, which is in the distributed unit in the baseband. So what does that mean? That means that Ericsson, in my opinion, has kind of hijacked the standard and made it so that if you actually want to be compliant and interface with the Ericsson baseband and radio units for their cloud RAN deployments or virtual RAN deployments, then you as a third-party vendor have to have 2 new flavors of your portfolio: a new distributing unit that has a compliance to Class A for Category B, and a new radio unit that has compliance for Class A Category B as well. So this obviously is going to increase the R&D efforts at those companies that want to be compliant to Ericsson. It also, again, allows Ericsson to be essentially in the driver's seat for the standard, and has really thrown a curveball to the rest of the Open RAN community.
Yeah, that's interesting, Earl. Thanks. So in addition to the forecasts and the numbers and the trends, your reports do a great job of capturing suppliers in the market. So if we limit that just to RF vendors, what's your latest ranking of those RF vendors? Who's on top? Did anyone surprise you with rapid growth or decline? And who should we be keeping an eye on?
I think it's no surprise to anyone out there in the industry that's been watching what's been going on that Huawei was still top supplier in 2023 and will probably be the top supplier over the next 5 years. So I don't see that changing, specifically because they have access to the market in China, where a lot of the other vendors don't. I think that, no surprise, ZTE was also number 2 in the market, and then we had the Nordic vendors coming in at number 3 and number 4. One of the things that I would be on the watch for is Samsung Networks. The Koreans have a very long perspective on the market and where they're going to be. And we just published several report on the financials for second quarter for Nokia, Ericsson, and Samsung. And if you look at the financial numbers, the mobile networks group accounts for less than 5% of total revenues at Samsung Electronics. So it's in the noise. And they have a very long view on how they're going to address the market. And I would expect that they're going to be a major player in the Open RAN story as we continue to move forward. And so that's where they're probably going to be able to take some market share. Some of the other vendors from a radio perspective, I think that Fujitsu on the radio side had a very stellar deal with Dish, and they were the primary supplier for the radios for Dish Network. And they are also going to be a secondary supplier to Samsung in some of their other deals. NEC is potentially another one. So what I would call, quote unquote, Team Japan on the radio side would be the ones to be on the watch for. We have some other smaller vendors like Viettel out of Vietnam, Tejas out of India. And so these are very country-specific plays and regional plays, but they're still very much in the noise at this point. And we'll see how they continue to perform as Open RAN continues to evolve, primarily Open RAN suppliers.
Earl, a lot of those suppliers offer the entire RAN solution. How does the ranking change if we consider the baseband and distribution unit suppliers? Are there new entrants in this segment that we should be aware of?
I think on the radio side, we've had guys like, and on the baseband side, we've had companies like Mavenir who are poised to kind of do well potentially in India. But India is a very tough market. They have not been successful. They've been somewhat successful in the U.S. with Dish. And there is some potential opportunities for Mavenir in Europe. But again, I think the other vendors are being ultra aggressive. And Huawei still is not kicked out of Europe and out of a lot of other regions around the world. So I think that's going to be a challenge for some of these new entrants in terms of pricing. And again, their financial stability, I think, is probably the most important thing I want to stress is if you're a mobile operator and you're looking for a new vendor, you want to make sure that that vendor is going to be around for the next 10 to 15 years. And if the financials for that vendor are somewhat sketchy, then the likelihood of you wanting to be dependent on them is going to be very low. And so I think there's a significant risk for some of these operators in looking at new entrants just because of the financial stability of these vendors.
Yeah, interesting. If we switch gears a little bit, I guess, well, what's going on from the architecture standpoint? What trends are you seeing in integration, technology, and I suppose philosophy with the RAN vendors?
If we look at the emerging 5G NR advanced spec and potentially 6G, I know we're thinking way out there, but it's actually coming to China at least for 5G NR advanced. And we're also upping the frequency band to 6 and 7 gigahertz. So what would be N102 and N104 for 3GPP standards. I think when we get up to those frequency bands, which is essentially doubling where we're at from the C-band perspective of 3.5 gigahertz, then the physics start to become a major issue in terms of how do I try to maintain my same macro cell radius and cell size and cell edges. In that situation, if I'm doubling everything up in terms of the frequency band, then realistically, my cell size is going to probably shrink in half. So if I'm shrinking my cell size in half, then I probably need to double my output power to make up for that cell shrinkage on the frequency band. And I probably need to add more antennas. So what I would expect to see as we go to the 6 gigahertz band and 7 gigahertz is that we go from a 64T configuration up to 128T, 128R. And then the question is going to be, at that particular array for the active side, what are the number of antenna elements that we're going to be tying into each one of those? Typically, right now, the ratio is 3-to-1. So 3 antenna elements for every radio transceiver chain that is integrated into the system. So if we start getting up to 128 transceivers, then you can do the math. There's going to be a lot of antenna elements. And again, those antenna elements will shrink in size because we're going up in frequency. So the actual overall size of the unit may increase maybe 25 to 30% in terms of the antenna panel, but will probably still be under 5 feet in terms of that panel compared to maybe just slightly over 3 feet right now for a 64T with 192 antenna elements. So again, I know people have been discussing whether or not 256T would be an architecture that could be used. Certainly, if we start looking at the 13 gigahertz or anything in the FR3 band, then you're looking at an incredible amount of antenna elements themselves because we're in microwave. And so we're typically talking about 1,024 antenna elements in that realm for anything above 8 gigahertz. And in that situation with the beamformers, then again, we're looking at a different architecture than we would be at the 128 transceiver architecture for the 8 gigahertz and below.
And so we've seen a number of press releases from companies and market research firms. They kind of indicate that the future of the wireless RAN market is a bit choppy. What are your thoughts about that? What are you forecasting?
I think if you look at the mobile operator data that's been announced for second quarter of this year, and you look at the CapEx spending, I wrote a piece on LinkedIn earlier about this. Everyone is talking about trying to de-lever their balance sheet. And I think that's going to be the key word for 2024 from a mobile perspective is there's a lot of debt that these operators have. A lot of that debt was brought on when interest rates were probably 0% or less than 1%. As interest rates have grown over the last 4 to 5 years, most of these bonds and debt that was incurred by the mobile operators are coming due. And as they come due and you try to refinance them, the rate is now 4+%, 5%, or whatever it is, depending on what region. So it's getting more expensive in terms of cost of capital. I think that is causing a lot of the operators to say, we need to conserve cash, we need to pay off our debt, and we're going to spend less on CapEx. Mostly because we need to figure out how to monetize 5G. We've deployed 5G. Now we're waiting for consumers to hop onto 5G networks. And the question is, will they pay more for it? And I think the answer is probably no. They'll get better speeds and additional coverage and higher data rates and such. Maybe availability won't always be there in terms of gigabits per second download. But I would expect that at least in the 100 plus megabit range on the download would be fairly consistent depending on which mobile operators and what we're seeing. And are they using real 5G spectrum? Are they using what I would call fake 5G with dynamic spectrum sharing using 4G channels? So the big issue right now is, yes, Pat, it is extremely choppy. This is going to be a horrible year, more than likely in terms of what we're already seeing out of the Ericssons, Nokias, and Samsungs and their financials. And the question is, does it come back in 2025? And the unfortunate answer is yes and no. Yes being that it comes back for China, no being that it doesn't really come back for the rest of the world. And I think on top of that, if you look at the spectrum that the Americas has, so that would include North and Latin America, all of N102 and N104 have been allocated to Wi-Fi, which means the entire Americas regionally is somewhat screwed from a 5G NR advanced perspective. We have no 6-7 gigahertz spectrum available at all to use for terrestrial wireless networks. The rest of the world has at least N104 available because they've allocated only N102 to the Wi-Fi guys. But unfortunately, all of the Americas, everything's allocated to Wi-Fi. So the next hop would be to try to go up to maybe 12 and 13 gigahertz in FR3 spectrum. And that is a very daunting proposition for any mobile operator to start considering microwave now as the primary macro radio unit for their network.
And kind of related to that and to the short term, if I can talk about technology and architecture again for just a second, the silicon community has always and still is pushing for that all silicon RAN solution, and they tout integration advantages and cost advantages, digital beamforming, and enough elements in the array to make silicon PAs the best choice. Do you think we're ever going to see that? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
I think the one thing that everyone seems to forget is, sure, the silicon PAs are cheap. I get them on a 300 millimeter wafer. Maybe I can make them into SiGe, right? Because CMOS is still extremely low power relative to, I think, where SiGe is, or GaN on silicon for that matter, if you count that as being silicon, Eric. But I think the biggest problem people forget is, sure, if I make the PA cheaper and I make the LNAs cheaper and all the stuff in the transceiver cheaper, how do I support that digitally? And I think that's where people forget that I need a digital part of that transceiver as well. So let's say I go to, right now for a 64T, I have 192 antenna elements. So if I wanted to go full digital beamforming, where now the antenna element is the critical part and not my transceiver, I need 192 transceivers. So 192 transceivers with, at best, on a digital front-end ASIC, having 16 channels would require me to have 12 ASICs. Right now, I have 4 ASICs that are doing as 16 channels to 64T architecture. So having 12 ASICs and essentially tripling the amount of digital silicon and the amount of processing power I'm going to need to now control 192 transceiver chains is going to start making the digital side of the radio extremely complicated and expensive. And also thermally, now probably your thermals are going to be more heavily weighted on the digital side than on the RF. So I think those are considerations that for those guys that are out there in silicon land need to think about is the overall system isn't going to get better, in my opinion, by going to CMOS. Frankly, I don't know if it's going to get better going to, higher orders of massive MIMO. I think what the operators care about is raw power. So that's the other thing that I think we need to consider is no one's giving up RF power. We started off with 80 watt active antenna units for massive MIMO, and now we're at 400 watts, and we could be getting up to 500 watts. So how do you get that power out? Can you get it out of a CMOS PA? I doubt it. So that's kind of my thoughts on where the silicon radio transceiver architecture is going. Maybe GaN on silicon could do it.
Interesting. Yeah, a heterogeneous integration and hybrid beamforming sounds like the best bet.
Yes, Pat. I think in terms of, again, cost, you can be in your little sandbox doing R&D, but if you're not making this unit and it's got to put out 400 watts and you have to lay out a board, and that's the other thing too, is how do you lay out 192 radio transceivers on a PCB?
Sounds like a tough, daunting task to me.
I think there's some realism that the industry has to look at, and I think that's why if you look at the major OEMs and what they're doing, it'll kind of give you a hint as what the architecture is, and none of those guys are going to digital beamforming, at least in the FR1 bands, anytime soon.
Great. So let's wrap it up with Eric's favorite question. If you were to get out your crystal ball, what would the macro cell and RAN market look like in the next 5 years? How would it grow and who would be the major players? What would we be talking about?
I think if we look 5 years out from now, number one, China will still be the number one market. India kind of ebbs and flows depending on what cycle they're in and how much money they have, etc. So you can't really count on them depending on what part of the cycle they're in. But China, you can. And China will be leading in 5G NR Advanced, and they'll probably be leading in 6G because of their policies within their telecommunications market and with the consent of the government and how they dictate how the spectrum is going to be allocated and such. And again, they're not bogged down by having to pay $100 billion to get spectrum for each one of the operators. So they're already net positive when you look at their landscape for telecom and for wireless. I think the Americas is going to be in trouble. Again, without N104 as spectrum, I think that's going to hurt both the North American market and Latin American market. So I would highly advise, if you were a regulatory agency in these countries, including the FCC, I would renege on the N104 ban and just go back to the Wi-Fi guys and tell them that we'll give you N102, but we want N104 back because we've kind of screwed up our industry because of that allocation. In terms of some of the suppliers, I think the one that everyone's on the watch for right now and not sure what's going to happen to them is Nokia. And I think that will probably be a situation that may resolve itself in the next couple of years. And we'll have to see how Nokia continues to perform over that period of time. New players, highly unlikely, and unless someone has $100 billion lying around that they don't want and they want to get into the wireless business, then I think that's going to be difficult. I think the majority of the radio suppliers that have emerged to be in the Open RAN area, the ones that are doing small cells, they'll probably survive. But if you're trying to do a macro radio, you're probably going to die. So that's kind of my forecast, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Earl, for that. That's a lot of excellent information. And since I didn't get to ask the crystal ball question, I'm going to close here. And we would like to thank you for sharing those thoughts with us. And for our listeners, Earl is talking with the system designers and companies that power the RAN industry. So he's always an excellent counterpoint to some of the more wildly optimistic claims that come out of the industry. And in addition, we always enjoy spending time with Earl. So thanks for taking the time to speak with us, Earl. And we look forward to catching up with you again in the future to see how things have evolved and what you have said has come true or not. And to our listeners, you can find more podcasts at podcasts.microwavejournal.com. And thanks for listening.